Welcome to ONA 20. This is a session called In Between Podcasts, in between episodes. My name is David Cohn, and I'm going to be your humble moderator. So good morning, good afternoon, good night, whatever time you're seeing this. We're really excited to bring you this panel of folks who are going to talk about their experience running podcasts and what they do in between episodes to engage their audience. So we're going to jump right into it with our first speaker, who is Doug from Buckeye Talk. Doug is the podcast host. So Doug, why don't you tell us a little bit more about yourself and your podcast, and more importantly, what you do to engage your audience in between episodes.
Thanks, David. Yeah, my name's Doug Maurice. I've been a sports writer for 25 years. I've been covering Ohio State football for the last 15 years for the Cleveland Plain Dealer and Cleveland.com, and nobody cared. Nobody cared about me until I had a podcast. It is remarkable. I talk about how, I've written thousands of articles over the years, and I can count on one hand. Maybe I'm just a bad writer. Nobody comes up and says, hey, great article. But when we started doing a podcast 5 years ago, people started saying, hey, I listen to Buckeye Talk. And so the idea of wanting to then take that, what you are establishing with your podcast, and carrying that through the rest of the week seems like a very natural thing to want to do, because that's how we connect best with our audience. There's a wide, saturated market covering Ohio State football, and we have differentiated ourselves with our podcast. And I think the most important thing that we're able to do with the podcast is, as all you podcasters out there do, is you get in people's phones. They don't have to come to you, you come to them. So you're doing that with your podcast, whether it's once a week, twice a week, every day. So we talk about how can you get in their phones in other ways? How can we get to our audience in other ways besides the podcast? Because that's where the connection is. Yes, there's a connection with our voices, with our personalities, but we want to be able to bring that voice and that personality to people the rest of the week. And so what we have done, and has been super important to us, is our Subtext platform that David has helped us get started at Cleveland.com and with Advanced Communications. We think of it is a texting platform where people sign up for $3.99 a month, and they get texts from us 2, 3, 4, 5 times a day with our insight, our news, our analysis of what's going on with what we cover. And we think of it, we have sold it to people as it's the podcast every day of the week. We text in that way, like we talk on the podcast, and it gets right in somebody's phone. They don't have to come find us. We come to them. And so this Subtext platform is a great way to do this. So if you can find a way to do that, so that when people, they're getting your podcast in your phone, now they're getting your text, or they're getting communications from you in your phone. And what we have created is a constant loop of loyalty. We have promoted Subtext on our podcast. We now use the podcast to get more Subtext subscribers. Then the Subtext subscribers help us create content for the podcast. We put out polls to text subscribers and talk about it on the podcast. We take questions only from text subscribers, and then we answer them on the podcast. So the way that we have done this is that we now have created the podcast lives every day. Now, to be honest, we are currently doing 5 podcasts a week. When we started off before the pandemic, we were doing 1 podcast a week. And this filled the gap for us. The Subtext filled the gap. But it's so important, I think, that if you can find a second avenue to both build loyalty to the podcast, and then also, create maybe a new revenue stream for the podcast, that's what we've been able to do. And then we have now everything that we do is the podcast. I am no longer a sports writer. David was asking me when I wanted to how I wanted to be introduced. I write for Cleveland.com and the Cleveland Plain Dealer. We have an Ohio State section on our website, but I don't want people to think of me or think of our coverage that way anymore. We're Buckeye Talk. Buckeye Talk started as a podcast in 2015, but now we want everything we do to be Buckeye Talk, to have that personality, to have that voice, to have that connection, because that's where we found the greatest connection is with our listeners and our readers, is through the podcast. So now when we go, we want you, when you come to our website, to not come to read our Ohio State coverage, but we want you to come and continue the Buckeye Talk experience. And when we send our texts, we don't call it Cleveland.com Ohio State coverage. It's Buckeye Talk. So I think if you have a successful podcast, you should become your podcasts, because that's, in my 25 years of doing this, I've never had a greater connection to people. I've never had more interest, more loyalty. People are now loyal to our style. And I see people asking, Trevor has a question, how do your fellow podcast hosters deal with a saturated market in your location? You have to try to differentiate yourself. But we talk about, first of all, it's a huge audience, so it's okay that it's saturated, because there's enough, we can split the pie up enough different ways. But you have to brand yourself in a way that it's not that just people are interested in your subject in Ohio State. They're interested in our view on Ohio State. And so now, with all of it, with our stories, our texts, and our podcasts, people know that we talk about fast food. People know that I'm afraid of robots. People know the coaches that I think are terrible, and we have inside jokes about them. And we want that idea to permeate everything we do. I think sometimes we can get in trouble when we have a lot of success with a podcast and that connection, but then we silo it off. We only think of it as, well, that's one thing that we do. We have really tried to lean into the idea of, this is the best thing that we do. It really is. I mean, I've been writing forever. The best thing that we do is our podcast. So we want to take that everywhere. And then it enhances your podcast, and your podcast enhances everything you do. So I know there are some of you out there probably who maybe are just podcast hosts, and maybe you can expand from your podcast and stay connected to your audience with other avenues, whether it's texting, whether it's on Twitter, whether it's with writing posts. But if you expand what you're doing, you have to keep that podcast vibe the whole way through. But I think if you are someone who does a podcast as part of your job, and you're also doing something else, I think branding, I think personality-wise, I think vibe, maybe there's an opportunity to lead into your podcast, and so that your podcast is not just talking into a microphone once a week. It's the way kind of that you cover your beat, and it's the way that you interact with your audience, and you carry that through all the time. So it can be saturated. It can be very hard to break through, but we have done that not with Cleveland.com's Ohio State coverage. We have done it with Buckeye Talk. And so finding that way, that subtext has been so valuable for us. And maybe there are other ways you can do it, but this idea of being able to text people with the things that we would say on the podcast if the podcast was happening right now, but it's not. So I'm going to text that to you is invaluable. And there's still, listen, we have a lot more podcast listeners than we do tech subscribers, but we talk about the tech subscription all the time on the podcast. And over time, if you're a loyal podcast listener, I think at some point you'll enjoy the podcast, but you might start feeling like you're being left out if you're not a tech subscriber. And if you can create that, listen, you love the pod, but we do this other thing. And if you really love what we do, you want to be part of that too. You're building on what you already do best. So we've been lucky to have this subtext opportunity come down the pike for us. It has fit exactly. I don't know how we would have promoted it if we didn't have a podcast, but we had a loyal, ravenous audience that was listening to us. And we thought, how can we bring them something more? How can we stay connected to them in between podcasts? And absolutely the best way for us has been texting things out. It's a nominal fee. And I always think about, what's the thing that you love the most? The thing that you love the most in life, if you had somebody who was an expert on that and was like, listen, I'll talk to you about it a couple times a week, but I'll also text you about it a couple times a day, I'd pay for that. So that's why I think it's been a great avenue for us. So thanks to you guys for being part of this. I've really enjoyed podcasting, but I also enjoy the texting because I enjoy staying connected to the audience in the best way that I've ever been connected to an audience in my 25 years as a journalist.
One quick question before we transition to Blair from Vox. But Doug, at some point this year, you went from one podcast a week to 5. So you're doing Monday through Friday. And I guess I'm curious, this is about filling the gap in between episodes. I mean, so what was the impetus for that? Was there such a gap that you felt like you needed to do it every day? Is there still a gap you feel like in between those episodes, or how does it work?
I think we went to 5 days a week because there was a pandemic and we thought everybody'd be sitting around and have time to listen to more podcasts. So we tried to fill that gap for our audience because of that. But now our football season is starting in October and we're still going to do 5 days a week. So it's one of those, yes, our gap has shortened, but there's still a gap. You know, we don't come out every hour. We come out every 24 hours. So there still is opportunity. Listen, you know, it's 3:00 in the afternoon. Maybe you got our podcast that came out at 6:00 in the morning, but another one's not coming out to the next day. Here's something at 3:00 in the afternoon. So no matter how many podcasts there are, there's still a gap and there's still an opportunity to fill that gap with other things.
Awesome. Well, thank you for that. We'll probably have some more questions for you later. And while I do appreciate all the Subtext stuff, one of the questions is, outside of Subtext, what are some platforms that can build a space? And I think some of our other speakers will be able to talk to that